Hey, it's Matt, your average gamer, and for this one, we're going to be covering Dragon Claw and Dragon Maul. And now for this one, we're going to be able to do a lot of physical damage, some posture damage. These are really fun to use. Let's get into the details. We're on to the Fire Giant here, and this is New Game Plus 7, so he has 64,000 HP, and we're going to be using Dragon Incantations on him. This is about a 4 or 5 minute fight. It's really intense. It ends up being a really tough fight in general, and we're going to check out mainly Dragon Maul and Grail's Roar for this one. We're going to save Dragon Claw and the chain casting you can do with that with 2 seals later in the video, and we'll go over that as well. It's going to be the same setup for both, and this is part 2, by the way, of the video that I did on Wednesday. I'm going to leave that one in the description too. And that video, by the way, has all the breath attacks. The amount of damage we were able to get out of with the Dragon Incantations in that video was actually pretty incredible for New Game Plus 7. Everything ended up turning out very, very well in terms of damage, so definitely be sure to check that one out too if you haven't yet. And let's get on to Dragon Maul here in Grail's Roar. Dragon Maul, by the way, is almost purely physical damage. It does a little bit of magic damage, but it does posture damage too, making it a powerful incantation that you can boost with the Dragon Communion seal by 15%. The same seal you're going to use for breath attacks because it's going to increase everything by 15% as I mentioned. And then the offhand, if we're using Dragon Maul, I actually prefer the Jellyfish Shield because it's 5% more, but I'm going to explain later in the video if you're chain casting, you're using Dragon Claw, which is much easier to chain cast. 2 seals is better in that instance. We were hitting the Fire Giant for respectable damage, but he does have a ton of HP, and keep in mind this is physical damage, and unlike the breath attacks, we're not really applying any additional status effects like Frost or Rot, and we're going for pure physical damage on each hit. So as you can see here, he ends up landing on my head. He does injure me a lot in this video. Usually I'm better at avoiding the Fire Giant, but again, this fight ended up being intense because instead of taking the time to learn them, I hadn't used them in a long time as far as Dragon Claw and Dragon Maul, I decided to immediately jump into the Fire Giant fight and had to get used to very quickly the long casting times. And the long casting times on this are even longer, I feel like, than the breath attacks, which in general do have long casting times. This, for the specific animation on Dragon Maul, does take a while, and it definitely takes a little bit to get used to too. It is worth it because it does a lot of physical damage, and you do get the posture damage as well. But again, it is a long animation, and I ended up getting hit a lot attempting to use it. It's one of those risk and reward situations where it's going to be, for you, it's going to be worth it. If you're using something where you have a solid setup and you're going against the majority of bosses, when you land this, you're going to do a good amount of damage. You're going to get that additional posture damage as well, even with the long casting time. And again, like most things in the game, you're going to learn how to get better at that, learn how to use it, and essentially make the best out of it because it is a very powerful incantation when used properly. And later in this video, as I mentioned earlier, the Godskin duo, by the way, you're going to end up being surprised. Even I was surprised at the amount of damage I was able to do with Dragon Maul on them. It literally ends up chewing through their HP. They're literally a couple of bites. At max scaling, they have around 40,000 HP. Later in this video, you're going to be able to check that out, and yeah, it's awesome against them. So the Fire Giant, probably not the best example in the world, given the fact that he has so much HP and a decent amount of, physical resistances and whatnot too, especially in his second phase, since it's harder to hit his weak points. But even so, he took good damage. However, I did end up running out of FP, and at the end here, we're going to end up using 2 occult knives to finish off the Fire Giant. In his second phase here, he has a lot more resistances, as I mentioned in general. If you're able to place or time it so you're able to hit his weak points, you can make the fight substantially easier. Even his hands will take more damage, but given the long casting times on both Grail's Roar, which I did for the debuff there, and Dragon Maul in general, I decided to go after his legs because it seemed like the obvious thing to do, a little bit safer of an area to attack, as opposed to the front of them with a very, very long animation in Dragon Maul. Yeah, this fight ended up being way more intense than I wanted it to be. It was longer than I wanted it to be as well. I knew going in that even on the first try, if I got him, it was going to be a little bit of a challenge getting used to everything and having to fight him while trying to basically learn stuff because, again, walking into the Fire Giant fight, it was essentially like the first time using these incantations again because I hadn't used them in a long time. I did the video on breath attacks, but that's a little bit different of a style, and you have a little bit more range for that. You can also rot him. You might be able to frost the Fire Giant. He's got reasonable frost resistance though, but those are a little bit easier to use on him as opposed to these, which you have to be up close and personal with the longer casting time. We've already invested in Arcane, by the way. You can use something like the Scavenger Curved Swords, or in my instance here, I'm using 2 knives on occult for a little extra damage. I don't have the setup particularly for it, but they are awesome backup weapons since you're investing in Arcane anyway. And yeah, the way the fight ended here was kind of insane, no doubt. This was definitely one of the more intense fire giant fights of recent memory that I had. This was definitely tough to do at the end here, given the fact that he had chewed through my HP, and we end up having to finish him off with dual daggers after using mainly Dragon Maul for the majority of the fight. And down goes the fire giant. And by the way, this next part I included in the last video, but I'm going to go over real quick just in the next minute where you get the Dragon Communion Seal and where you get the incantations from, the good ones at least. Now for the Dragon Communion Seal itself, you can get that from this very specific night at the first site of grace. There's a dungeon. You'll use 2 stone sword keys, I believe, to get in. And then after you follow the chariot down 2 pathways, essentially, you can either go back up or go down. If you go back up, you'll find that specific knight who will drop the Dragon Communion Seal, and there it is on the map there. And where do you get all the good Dragon Communion incantations? Well, you get them from the Dragon Communion Church that is in Caelid. This church in Caelid will have everything for you. I'll show it on the map here in a second. And as you defeat dragons, gain dragon hearts as well as their abilities, you can purchase them with the dragon hearts. And then that is in Caelid. Very easy to get to. You can actually get here from the start of the game, and I'm going to show you on the map here where it is, and it is in South Caelid there on the map. You can grab everything you need. Now on to the Godskin duo. This is where we end up doing a lot of damage. We did use Sleeping Pots, a couple of buffs in Golden Vow and Howl Shabriri. We'll go over those later in this video, and the amount of damage that we get out of this is actually quite incredible. So the damage here, as I mentioned, it really ends up being a lot of damage, and you can do posture damage. I think I mentioned this earlier in the Fire Giant clip, but as far as the Godskin duo themselves, with just 2 bites, it takes the majority of their health bar. As you can see, the Godskin Apostle went down, and then we go after the heavy one here, who was just 3 hits with the bite. It does a lot of damage. Dragon Maul is very powerful. I want to mention real quick as we're fighting the Godskin duo here, if you're not subbed, now's the time to sub to this channel. We're going to be doing constant Elden Ring content from software games, Souls games in general. I've been playing a little bit of Bloodborne lately too. It's been really fun. It's actually my first playthrough of the game. It's been fantastic so far. Now's the time to sub to this channel, so definitely be sure to hit that sub button. Godskin Apostle can be a little bit of a pain with the Sleeping Pots, but we're not going to worry too much about that because eventually he's going to try to spawn in his buddy, the Godskin Noble, and when he does that, we'll be able to put him to sleep, and then the heavier one will really never end up dodging it. He does move there, but that's just a random movement. As far as his ability to dodge, he most of the time will just tank the Sleeping Pots and go immediately to sleep, which helps us significantly. And then we can go buff again, use Howl Shabriri again, and then get a ton of damage out of Dragon Maul, which once again chews through literally half their HP. Even though I do end up missing there, it does a crazy amount of damage against the Godskin duo. Now that they're down as well on New Game Plus 7, we're going to go over Dragon Claw as well and how to chain cast that. We're going to show off some mobs and whatnot, and then we'll go over the build, stats, everything you need to know towards the end of this video. Everything's time-stamped as well. Let's get into Dragon Claw. So this character had already grabbed the Dragon Communion Seal on this specific run, so I wasn't going to get another one, and I just ended up using another seal to show the ability to chain cast it, essentially how to chain cast it. But typically you would use 2 Dragon Communion Seals. I'll leave that in the description if you get your hands on 2. And then you can chain cast Dragon Claw consistently by using RB and LB. I'm on Xbox, basically going back and forth with your right and left hand using Dragon Claw. Can consistently be chain casted essentially to the point where as long as you have the FP, as long as you have the stamina, it's a little bit stamina costly. I think I may or may not have mentioned that, but as far as being able to cast it, you can just continually use this, and it's especially useful for mobs and such. On bosses, you may get knocked down. It does have good hyper armor. Both Dragon Maul and Dragon Claw have decent hyper armor, but again, it's a little more useful in my opinion against mobs. I particularly like Dragon Maul for bosses better because it does more damage. Definitely be useful against mobs. It can destroy mobs simply by being able to basically continually use Dragon Claw. It's something I do enjoy using, by the way. It's a lot of fun to use, and the setup here is going to be similar to the one that I had in the other video, so you can universally use both. I think I mentioned that earlier, that I'm going to leave that one in the description below, and then you can combine breath attacks and then Dragon Claw, Dragon Maul, and Grail's Roar all together to make a very powerful dragon build. Now it's time to get onto the buffs for this build, and then we'll go over stats, equipment, and everything you need to know. Since I was using the stance breaking tier, the order is going to be a little bit different. We're going to use Golden Vow first, and then we're going to use Howl Shabriri, after which we're going to fill up our FP. After that, because the stance breaking tier is only 30 seconds, we're going to use that. And then we can use the Jellyfish Shield, or if you're running two seals, dual seals, you can end up doing that. And you get the extra 20% for the Jellyfish Shield if you're using Dragon Maul, which by the way is 5% more than the Dragon Communion Seal. And then with two seals, you can chain cast Dragon Claw. No, that's a lot of info, but it's all there. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Dragon Communion Seal plus 10, preferably another one in your offhand as well. I had two occult daggers. I was running the Jellyfish Shield. It had a random set on, but we did hit 52 poise. Phlox Canvas Talisman, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Roar Medallion. Then we have the stance breaking tier and the magic tier because it does a little bit of magic damage on top of the physical damage. Let's get into stats for this build. For stats, I mentioned this in my other video, the soft cap, the cap that you're going to want to hit as long as you're using the Dragon Communion Seal. If you're around level 125, you're doing the meta, or level 150, the cap is going to be 45 Arcane and then 30 Faith. Anything after that, points should be put in Arcane, you'll get more out of it. Faith should be pretty much capped at 30. This video was helpful. I hope this turns into a very powerful dragon build for you. It is a really powerful build, and the other videos in the description below if you want to do the breath attacks too. You can combine these two together and you can go and destroy the majority of bosses with this setup. Dragon Ball does a lot of damage especially. Really fun to use too, and if you're not on the Discord, by the way, definitely be sure to join that. We're closing in on 500 people now. It's been a great community. If you're not subbed and you love overpowered PvE builds, be sure to check out all the awesome builds that are on my channel. Thanks for watching, and as always, I will catch you guys there.